Welcome everyone, good afternoon, and welcome to our audience in Africa, if you're watching from across the ocean, or to all who are joining us from around the world. One of the great, I guess, silver linings of the pandemic has been that we've been able to reach a worldwide audience these past couple of years, thanks to the technology of Zoom. So we're excited to be broadcasting out to the world and making the Neustadt Lit Fest a truly international gathering of voices. So we do encourage you to take advantage of the chat function, and throughout the session we'll be talking to Dr. Marame Gueye and Dr. Fatoumata Seck, and they will be talking to us rather first, and then we'll be basically discussing the work of our 2022 Neustadt International Prize for Literature winner, Boubacar Boris Diop, who I believe is the fourth African writer to win the Neustadt Prize, including Assia Jabar and Nuruddin Farah and Mia Couto over the past probably 25 years. And now Diop is our first Francophone West African writer to win the prize. So it's really a historic occasion. I think it's a really wonderful moment of literary history that we're celebrating together. And so we'll talk about Diop's work this afternoon and try to understand what drives him as a writer, what tips do our scholars have to understanding his work, and we'll see where it leads us. So without further ado, again, my name is Daniel Simon. I'm the editor-in-chief at World Lit Today. It's been a great pleasure for me to be part of the Neustadt tradition for the past 20-some years now, and I'm really excited to be back again with our distinguished guests this afternoon. I will introduce Dr. Seck first, and she will talk a little bit about her perspective on Diop's work, and then we'll proceed with Dr. Gueye. So Fatoumata Seck is an assistant professor of French and Francophone Studies at Stanford University. Dr. Seck holds a joint appointment at the Center for Comparative Studies in Race and Ethnicity, and a courtesy appointment in the Department of Comparative Literature at Stanford. Her book manuscript, Materializing Imaginaries in Postcolonial Senegal, examines ways in which writers, filmmakers, and artists reframe economic thought and practices through art, thereby creating social, political, and economic imaginaries in post-colonial Senegal. She received a PhD in French with an anthropology minor and a certificate in African Studies from Stanford. Her scholarship has appeared in a number of journals and is forthcoming in the Routledge Encyclopedia of African Studies. Welcome, Dr. Seck.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you, Daniel, for this introduction, and thank you, Lisa, for all your help setting up this event and getting me on this Zoom meeting, because I did have trouble logging in earlier. So I can share my screen, but I don't necessarily have to. It's just to help people follow the presentation. So hopefully, all right, that's perfect. And I also like to say that it's a pleasure to be here and to share the space with Marame. Hello, Marame. And I'll just begin right now with my presentation. So there are multiple ways, multiple perspectives from which to explore the multifaceted work of Boubacar Boris Diop. And as I was considering which aspect to focus on, I found myself constantly returning to his formative years to get a better sense of his work and its development. For that reason, I propose a quick foray into Boris Diop's formative years, followed by an exploration of the most salient aspects of his work to better understand the award-winning writer, the journalist, the playwright, the screenwriter, the essayist, the philosophy and literature professor, the critic, the translator, and the editor he has become. Accounts of Boubacar Boris Diop's literary influences usually begin with his absorption of European, mainly 19th century French literature, which dominated his father's library. As a child, these texts hurled him into imaginaries of foreign lands, and through these, he developed an insatiable passion for literature. Alongside the library of his father, which Diop read during the day, stood that of his mother, wall of oral tales, which he would listen to at night. These tales introduced him to the craft of storytelling and to the power of magical realism well before his first encounter with Gabriel Garcia Marquez's 100 Years of Solitude, a writer who would later influence his work. Beyond the dual schema of his father's library in French and his mother's oral tales in Wolof, Diop encountered African writers in his teenage years, such authors such as Léopold Sédar Senghor, Aimé Césaire, Frantz Fanon, Mongo Betty, Ousmane Sembène, Cheikh Hamidou Kane, David Diop, Aikwe Arma, and of course, Cheikh Anta Diop. These writers and thinkers would soon spark in him a rebellious spirit. It was the height of his formative years, and this time shaped, as Liana Nissim has noted, quote, a political consciousness that would contribute powerfully to the making of his oeuvre. Diop also became an avid reader of Latin American literature and was particularly influenced by Ernesto Sabato, of course, Garcia Marquez, and Juan Rulfo, among others. And beyond Latin America, he remembers being taken with the work of Fyodor Dostoevsky, Franz Kafka, and more importantly, Jean-Paul Sartre. These years of literary foraging, as he calls it, took place in the second half of the 20th century during the Cold War and the global 60s, decolonization, the emergence of a three-world order, and the daunting task of turning newly independent countries into democratic nations in an era of polarizing conflicts. His generation was therefore influenced by Karl Marx, Mao Zedong, Frantz Fanon, Amilcar Cabral, Kwame Nkrumah, and more. Diop was exposed to these influences through book and cinema clubs that he formed with his friends and hosted in his home. It was during this time and throughout the 1970s that he learned about local and anti-colonial unsung heroes such as Aline Sitoé Diatta, Ndateya Lambouch, Queen of Wallo, and Sidia Léon Diop, who often appear in his novels alongside African revolutionary leaders assassinated in the 60s and 70s, such as Lumumba and Cabral. It was also around that time, in his own words, that his tormented and existential anguish earned him the moniker Boris, after Boris Serguin, a character in Jean-Paul Sartre's three-volume novel, Les Chemins de la Liberté, The Roads to Freedom. In other words, while his exposure to his parents' libraries made him believe that he could, quote, create the world with words, his Marxist, Pan-Africanist, and anti-colonial libraries, underpinned by Sartrean engagement, shaped the rebellious spirit of his youth. Cameroonian author Mongo Betty explains in the preface to Diop's first published novel, Le Temps de Tamango, The Time of Tamango, published in 1981, that so-called committed literature was not a choice, but an imperative of the time. He saw Boris Diop's experimental literary style as particularly effective to explore the issues that African writers would face for years to come. To date, Diop has authored 17 books, including 7 novels in French, 3 in Wolof, 2 plays, a collection of short stories, a biography, a self-translation, or more like an adaptation of his first novel in Wolof, Domigolo, into French, and a translation of Aimé Césaire's Une saison au Congo into Wolof, as well as numerous journalistic and essayistic writing. Diop's first published novel, Le Temps de Tamango, has not been translated into English, and yet it is in this novel that he introduces what critics have called un style borisien, or a Borisian style. And these literary techniques were fine-tuned in Diop's subsequent books and became recurring features of his novelistic writing. I would now like to explore 3 of the most salient aspects of Diop's work. The affordances of literature, a central theme in his texts. Another important feature is the stakes of memory, a question that dovetails with his complex approach to time and history. And finally, his work on African languages. Far from being discouraged by the limited number of Wolof readers, Diop has made it clear that his novels in Wolof are not just for today. He writes for future audiences, and such a linguistic wager, that is writing in a language whose audience has yet to come, is suffused in Diop's Wolof prose. Now, let's take a stroll through his oeuvre to examine how these 3 elements interlock: the affordance of literature, the stakes of memory, the wager of writing literature in Wolof for an audience that has yet to come. And these, I argue, are tied to varying degrees to his formative years and to the intensive period of literary foraging during which his rebellious spirit and his alter ego Boris emerged. If you are reading a novel by Boubacar Boris Diop, expect 1 or 2 of his multiple narrators to call out to you and to reflect on the fraught relationship between fiction and reality, or between history and memory. His novels are sites of aesthetic experimentation with time jumps, fragmented stories interspaced with metafictional concerns of the narrators, and speculative musings of futures pasts. Often understood as postmodern, his polyphonic texts expose the reader to multiple, often opposing perspectives. The narrative structures are complex and may seem unruly at first, but they abide by a specific logic. Diop explained in an interview that, quote, human consciousness does not move in a straight line, which might explain why his stories take readers through the labyrinthine metaphysical quests of his characters. Along the way, these characters wrestle with some of Diop's main preoccupations, ranging from the political to the existential, Pan-Africanism, neocolonialism, the figure of the revolutionary intellectual, violence and authoritarian regimes, cultural alienation, identity, the politics of memory, the image of Africa as portrayed in the media, the relationship between France and its former colonies, and more. To shed light on these complex issues, Diop often blends political fiction, political fables, and detective fiction. That is the case in his novels Cavena, Le Temps de Tamango, Les Traces de la Meute, or The Traces of the Pack, Les Tambours de la Mémoire, or The Drums of Memory, which all begin with a murder. In addition to political and detective fiction, Diop blends epics, fables, tales, parables, and proverbs, as well as the marvelous and the allegorical, creating characters who wrestle with madness as they attempt to retrieve lost or repressed memories. He uses madness and sub-stories as devices to unsettle linearity and to multiply narrative voices, which Susan Gorman has called schizophrenic doubling. The same could be said of his use of mirrors, an important device in his work as well. Diop's books are replete with mise en abîme and instances of epistolary embedding. In other words, in his stories, there are always books, notebooks, or letters being written to characters that the reader will sometimes never get to meet. For example, the character Kader in Le Temps de Tamango is writing a book entitled Le Temps de Tamango about the main character of the novel, Nongo, whose pseudonym is Tamango. In Diop's latest novel in Wolof, Malan Lundum, literally wrapper or veil of obscurity, but which Diop translates as nighttime stories, the story reaches us through the mediation of Asta Balde, who is the secretary of an elderly man, Sega Touré, for whom she writes the story. Asta also writes letters to her husband, through which we learn about her job writing the very novel we're reading. The overwhelming self-referentiality of Diop's works points to the constructed nature of the literary text, and as Adele King has noted, to Diop's mockery of novelistic convention. His prose is filled with irony. One of the multiple narrators, his multiple narrators once defined the novelist as a person who can say pretty much anything in the name of imagination. As Nasrin Kader writes in her foreword to The Night and His Shadow, Diop has often repeated that he draws from Birago Diop's use of the old proverb, when memory goes to collect dead wood, it brings back the bundle that pleases it. Here, just as imagination, Diop sees the use of memory in storytelling as a form of creative freedom. However, after his experience in Rwanda, Diop took a break from his aesthetic game, a game in which fiction and reality play hide and seek. And he even criticizes his prior representations of the genocide, such as in The Night and His Shadow. He believed that writing with, quote, simplicity about the genocide and maintaining, quote, factual precision were important for the silenced memory of those who perished. I went to Rwanda to write a novel, but history caught up with me, Diop said a decade after his trip. Now let's take another path, the stakes of memory, which intersect with the path I have just explored, the affordances of literature, and with the last one, I will explore the paths of language as a wager. Memory has been at the heart of Diop's work long before the 1998 Rwanda Writing by Duty of Memory project, which led to the publication of his famous novel, Murambi, the Book of Bones, in 2000, about the genocide against the Tutsi. Prior to Rwanda, Diop learned about the imperative of memory through Frantz Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth, which he read during his formative years in cultural clubs in the 60s and 70s. Fanon's embedding of Fodeba Keita's poem African Dawn in his chapter about national literatures led to Diop's writing of his first play, Charoy Terre Rouge, or Charoy Red Earth, which is based on Keita's famous poem. It was followed by an unpublished screenplay entitled Charoy 44, which Diop authored with filmmaker Ben Jogaibe. In it, they revisit the story of the massacre of African infantrymen who had fought for France during World War II. The men were killed in December 1944 by French forces in the military camp located in Charoy, a suburb of Dakar, for protesting over pay gap vis-a-vis of white officers and over back payment for services rendered in 1940. Through Charoy and Rwanda, Diop sounds the alarm about collective amnesia and its impact on the ever-growing rift between African youth and their history. He does the same in Bamelo Kochbama, his second novel in Wolof, which is about the Jola shipwreck. The ferry linking the city of Ziguinchor in Casamance to Dakar capsized during a storm in 2002, leaving only 64 survivors out of 1,900 passengers. Diop has written both journalistic and fictional texts about the tragedy. In the novel, he gives a voice to the dead, which prompted Serine Sey to call it a novel of resurrection. In an important passage of the book, Ndiémé, two of the central characters, Ndiémé asks Kiné, why do you spend your time resurrecting the dead? This line, with its evocative alliteration, dekil, spend time resurrecting, poetically describes Diop's own obsession with memory. To that question, Kiné, who died in the shipwreck, responds with a proverbial interrogation, how can one remember tomorrow if they neglect the past? The stakes of remembering are thus high, which Diop demonstrates in his works, such as in Murambi, the Book of Bones, which Toni Morrison famously called a miracle. It is to date Diop's most widely read and translated work, and it was listed, as you already know, among the 100 best African books of the 20th century by the Zimbabwe International Book Fair. But Rwanda was transformative for Diop beyond being a significant topic of his award-winning literary works. The genocide influenced his decision to start writing in Wolof. Now let's move to the last path, the linguistic wager. Oh, that's why I don't share PowerPoints, always forget to go through the slides. There it is. So most contemporary sub-Saharan African writers write in a European language, an issue that has preoccupied the field of African literature since its inception. When Diop realized the extent of France's involvement in the Rwandan genocide and the genocide's link to the geopolitics of the French language in France's former African colonies, his desire to create fiction in French was irrevocably altered. While he did not stop writing in French, he decided to act on Cheikh Anta Diop's injunction in the 40s and 50s for African writers to write in their mother tongue. Wolof is the most widely spoken language of Senegal. It transcends ethnic boundaries. Many Senegalese use Wolof as their primary language of communication. More than 80% speak it as their first or second language. About 32% of the Senegalese urban population is fluent in French. And yet, French is the official language of government, administration, the main language of official education and journalism, print journalism. Thus, Wolof, which dominates in number of speakers, is read and written in standardized form in Latin script by only a small minority. Diop is very conscious of this fact, and thus his approach to writing in Wolof took the form of a multifaceted project that involved teaching, writing, translating, and publishing Wolof in both print and online. Against a reductive and Eurocentric approach to world literature, Diop's work in Wolof has generated important conversations at the intersection of African and world literature. Tobias Warner convincingly argues that Diop's translation of Aimé Césaire's Une saison au Congo into Wolof, quotes, asks us to imagine the future of world literature otherwise. That's a very important point because, as I said earlier, since Diop has been imagining possible futures since his first published novel, which is a satirical speculative fiction. Further, Glenn Goldblatt shows how in Domigolo, Diop offers, through the use of the verb lundumtu, or finding one's way through the dark, a mode or an experience of reading, which opens up a space for reading and, quote, writing difference while exploring its possibilities. As a metaphor, then, lundumtu could be a way of apprehending Diop's decision to write in an African language, despite the uncertain outcome of his wager. Drawing from his experience of translating his own book, Diop has noted the untranslatability of what might be called a Wolof cultural imaginary into French, hence his explanatory and free approach to self-translation. So beyond his ethical and political reasons, then the process of writing and self-translating his first novel in Wolof, Domigolo, enabled him, in his own words, to measure the alarming extent of the loss of not writing in one's own language. To conclude, I would say that there are manifold aspects of Diop's work. The rich and complex creative work he has thus far produced cannot be boiled down to just the three elements I've explored today. These elements, however, the affordance of literature, the stakes of memory, and the linguistic wager, are, however, essential for understanding his oeuvre and his evolution as a writer. They are also interconnected. Diop's work on language is intrinsically tied to the stakes of memory, and he emphasizes memory as an imperative through his way of constantly interrogating the affordances of literature. The stakes of remembering Charoy, the Rwandan genocide, the Jola shipwreck, the unsung heroes of anti-colonial resistance are all tethered to the slower and more pernicious loss of other ways of knowing and seeing the world. In other words, the loss of cultural imaginaries and the languages that carry them. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Seck. That was really a wonderful overview of Diop's work. And my students and I have been trying to make sense of his translated novels into English and his essays, and have been reading a lot about contemporary African literature. And that's all very helpful in terms of understanding especially the stakes of memory, I think, are really so important to him, but also this linguistic wager that he's making on publishing in Wolof, translating Césaire and other writers into Wolof, and many of these issues that come to the fore in his recent work. So again, thank you, and we'll have time for questions and answers at the end of our session here this afternoon. We'll first listen to Dr. Marame Gueye, to have her tell us a little bit about Diop's work from her perspective. She is an associate professor of African and African diaspora literatures at East Carolina University. Her work is on verbal art, gender, language, and immigration. Dr. Gueye is also a scholar activist of women's rights in Senegal and its American diaspora. Among other publications, she is a contributor to Women's Songs from West Africa, a link to which you can find on our bookshop link for the festival, which I placed in the chat already. So please welcome Marame Gueye.
Thank you, Dr. Simon. I don't have a PowerPoint, so I'm hoping that people will be able to follow. I'm honored to be here, and I also wanted to take the moment to congratulate Boris Diop for this prestigious prize. And I'm honored to be included in this and share a panel with Fatoumata Seck also. My presentation is titled Between Murambi and Domigolo, Boubacar Diop's Proverbial Narratives of Self and the Postcolonial African Nation. In Murambi, the Book of Bones, we are told that Simeon Ebenezer detests proverbs and everything else that they call ancient wisdom. But we are not told why such despise for local discourses about human life and experiences. Could it be because in African communities, proverbs translate our deepest, most complex realities and experiences, make us anticipate the future by reading our present in complex and prophetic ways? In his extensive study of African oral literatures, Isidore Okpeo writes that the overriding value of proverbs is that they may be considered the storehouse of the wisdom of the society. This wisdom is spread across the African continent and provides continuity across cultures. As a writer, Boubacar Boris Diop mirrors many of his characters who are often men in the spring of their lives, who gather the next generations to tell them the story of times past for them to envision the possibilities of the future. Both Ebenezer in Murambi and Giran Faye in Domigolo are bearing witness and attempting to salvage what is left of life at the intersections of coloniality and the challenges of the post-colonial African nation. Though Murambi is in French and Diop hardly uses any proverbs, the narrative scheme mirrors proverbial foreshadowing and the moralistic aspects of proverbs that often ask us to learn from our past lessons as we move forward toward the future. His writing is a representation of proverbs from the Wolof language, his native language, to which he returns to right after gifting the world with Murambi, the Book of Bones. Diop has shared that his return to Wolof was in part out of frustration with the role of the French in the Rwandan genocide. This shift to Wolof is a representation of the Wolof proverb, ku xamul fa nga jëm, dellul fa nga jóge woon. If you do not know where you're going, go back to where you came from. This return to where one came from is not of abandonment as in giving up, but rather it is an attempt to look inward, recenter oneself, and reorganize to move forward. Boubacar Boris Diop urges us to go back to what we knew, or rather, what is left of what we knew, the vestiges, to find directions to our lives as Africans. The meaning behind Boubacar Boris Diop, a Senegalese predisposition to write about Rwanda, cannot be found in the shared French colonial history between Rwanda and Senegal. It is present in the two post-colonial countries' shared African heritage that is visible in their mores, the ancient wisdom of their African ancestors. In Murambi and Domigolo, which I consider the two works that sum up Diop's novelist trajectory,
Diop uses a narrative technique that is reminiscent of how proverbs function in African discourse. However, like Ebenezer, Diop does not ask us to readily accept these proverbs blindly. He incites us to critically assess them and expand them to open wider possibilities for posterity. Here, I'm joining Jonathan Rapinez's analysis of Domigolo, in which he reads the novel as part of an epic tradition and highlights Diop's play with proverbs. I backtrack by showing that this fixation with proverbs spans Diop's entire work and is evident in Murambi, even though in this text, he does not use a lot of proverbs. Several chapters of Murambi can be read as a proverbial narrative. The first section of the book, entitled Fear and Anger, is a representation of Liram Chinyak Bilajum. That thing that is crawling is heading toward the shed. As the book opens, we can feel that something evil is brewing. We can sense it, yet both reader and characters are in denial about the atrocious possibilities of the moment. The 1994 Rwandan genocide was preluded by the 1959 killings, during which over 300,000 Tutsi fled Rwanda. That event and its seriousness was ignored because maybe many naively believed that Rwanda was a family and that these killings were just incidental and isolated. Another proverb that Diop narrativizes is Kuray say non, say mbok ñoy njëkk a jeex. He who kills his enemies will find that his relatives will be the first to be exterminated. This proverb literally says that our relatives are among our enemies, but at the same time, it goes deeper by telling us that maybe killing is not the best approach to take toward one's enemies. Although this proverb is about how one's enemies are among one's relatives, I flip it here and applied it to Dr. Karakezi's killing of his wife and children. One must question here how the doctor arrived at hating his enemies, the Tutsi, more than he loved his children. To understand this complexity of family as enemy, one must go back to how in the 1900s, the French left and applied racist rhetoric to separate the Hutu from the Tutsi, making the latter a superior ethnicity because of their thinner noses. Prior to this racist differentiation, Hutu and Tutsis were one family and intermarried. Dr. Karakezi had to see some good in his wife to choose her as the mother of his children. At the time, love was stronger than hate. He loved his wife more than he hated her ethnic background. What turned family into enemy? The creation of the enemy stemmed from Belgian colonialists and Christian missionaries who categorized the Twa, the Hutu, and Tutsi and established a Tutsi supremacy. By referring to the common language and food that the Hutu shared with the Tutsi, Diop reminds us that there was a time when all three ethnicities lived in harmony and viewed each other as part of a whole. I'm sorry. The next proverb that Diop epitomizes in Murambi is Sundox Turo and Bakamo ci des. When water is spilled, all that is left is to skim the mud. When blood is spilled, all that is left is to gather the bones. In this part of the novel, we meet Simeon Ebenezer as he tries to make sense of the genocide and heal his community, including Cornelius, the son of the butcher of Murambi, Dr. Kurekezi. I use the concept of when water is split, what is left is to skip the mud, to read Murambi as a work of reconstitution, reassemblage, reconciliation with oneself and the others, not in desperation, but in an attempt to learn from one's past mistakes and revelations, to create something new that one can be satisfied with. The mud that is skimmed is thick and uncertain, but the traces of water that is in it makes it valuable, and the other elements that come with that water gives it taste, color, and texture. There are many things that can be made from that mud. The pot that is made of that soft material and then cooked in fire becomes strong and beautiful. This is not to say that one must spill water or commit genocide to create a new and beautiful nation. The water that was spilled was not by accident. There are many steps to its spilling as Rwanda was heading toward genocide under the watchful eyes of many, yet nothing was done to stop it. Some even wanted it and accelerated it. In Marame, Diop gives us all these steps, but most importantly, he gives us hope that we can do something with the mud. The skimming of the mud is gentle, methodical, and focused. It must be done with care and consideration of the lessons learned as well as where we want to go. The Rwanda of today testifies to that process. Of course, there are many layers to what Rwanda is today, and some of them are controversial. But if it is heralded as one of the most promising African countries, the process of skimming mud that Diop has showed us seems to have worked to some extent. And Bach is also resistant. Resilience, agency, hope, determination. Your hands will be dirty. Back and blood are slippery. Bones are fragile and brittle. They need to be gathered with care, kindness, and gingerly. A metaphor of our fragility as humans, but it is also an act of courage. Bach is not pretty, but it is that same mud that can make a beautiful pot or a house. It is versatile. It is building material just like bones. Boris is desperate to do this gathering by telling the stories, putting flesh and soul on the gathered bones and making them rise from the dead. There is urgency. This gathering is done gingerly but determinedly in front of everyone, as if to say, even as we move forward, we will not forget. We are gathering the bones together. You will watch me do it. Hear the clicking of the bones. I will bring back the souls that inhabited these bones, not to haunt us, but to make us imprint our memories with our atrocity. Fi fatte khaju. There is no space to forget. Boris won't let us forget. The dead will not let us forget because they live in us, in our guilt, the startle of noise, the clickety of the cooking pot that reminds us of machetes. Fi fatte khaju. There is no space to forget. Marame is a narrative of creation, reparation, resurrection. Boris himself is part of that new human, emerging from the mud, the bones, a new soul, a new writer. Because after Marame, he decided to write in Wolof. Is it a return to ancient wisdom, a way to prove to Simeon that actually our salvation as colonized communities is to try to go back to what is left of our ancient wisdom? Did writing Marame, the Book of Bones in French, leave a sour taste in his mouth? His mentor, Cheikh Anta Diop, has once said that Ken manul takamtiku lu neex ci làmmiñu jàmbur. One cannot savor something good with someone else's tongue. Where do you go after Rwanda? Boris, we, like Ebenezer, don't know. It is only right then that we go back where we came from. The healing from the trauma and confusion of Rwanda can only be started with a return to home. The return is not lethargic or of abandonment. It requires courage and hard work. There again, another wise man, someone who has never written, takes the role and through stories, put a mirror in front of us for us to look deep and be alarmed at the extent of our fragmentation by virtue of our mimicking of others, for us to see that we are at the stage of calcification in monkey state and that it is urgent for us to do something. The truth we need to hear can only be told in our own tongue, Wolof. Boris's mentor, Cheikh Anta Diop, was right. I push to say that it was hard to tell the world truth in someone else's tongue. So in Doomu Golo, rightfully so, Boris prefaces most of the chapters with a proverb. And the first proverb that I actually want to start us off with is "Wach sa and bo fek sa bodem fek fa borom mutok." If you leave your earthstone, whichever earthstone you go to, you will find its owner on it. Meaning that those we mimic dictate the convention of our speech. Ngiran Faye asked Badutal, do you think God has created a people that is better at imitating others than Black people? As its title suggests, Domigolo refers to the proverb, Domigolo golo rekledon. The monkey's child will always be only a monkey. If Africans are always keen to mimic others and reject their own, they will not be fulfilled humans. They will remain at the animalistic state where the white man placed them. Our inheritance from the generation before us determines our trajectory. Golo, in Senegalese folk tales, is a fool who's often duped by others. He is often cowardly and does not have a sense of self. His identity fluctuates because it always mimics others. Ngiran Faye presents Africans with a mirror in which they should look at themselves and take stock of their deformation. From the failed state epitomized by Daoud Diagne, the leader of the country, the fictional country, to the citizens with hollow identities who just exist. Mimicry and copying has turned Africans into monkeys. Yasin Yai's desire to be white and her fragmented sense of self is precursor to Mbisin and Bisan, her children's lives. The two young monkeys singe their mother and are flat characters with no sense of who they are. Mone askan wi soxla na seetu, as Ngiran says, the community needs a mirror. Indeed, the community needs a mirror. We need to look at ourselves again. The truth might be hard to hear, but when you are brave enough to face it, you will only benefit from it. Scholars who wrote about Domigolo and its proverbial essence in its title often focus on Yasin Yai and her children's Mbisin and Bisan as the metaphorical monkeys. However, this proverb can also apply to Badou Tall, to whom the notebooks are addressed. His father, Assane Tall, died in exile, yet Badou himself has left Senegal for abroad, Nyarala for abroad, leaving Ngiran a destitute for the family he worked to create. Domi Golorek Ledon, a monkey's child will always be a monkey, is another version of the wall of saying, Kewel dutup dom jibut. If the antelope jumps over, its cub will do the same. The generational legacies of immigration is at the center of Ngiran's notebooks and his subtle grief and loneliness as he sets out to recount life, fixating events for Badou Tall and those who come after him to look themselves in the mirror and recreate their lives as Black people who know who they are and where they came from. Boris does not ask us to idealize where we came from either, but rather, as Rapinez has argued, to accept it with all its complexities. The first part of Domigolo is prefaced with the proverb, Gone matna bayi cim rew. Ngiran flips the proverb mak matna bayi cim rew, which means that an older person is worth living in a country. So Boris flips it and says that a child also is worth living in a country, to show that our ancient wisdom does not mean much if we do not use common sense and expand them to include the evolution of our world. Gone matna bayi cim rew urges us to consider the plight of our African youth who, like Badou Tall, are looking outside, reverting to emigration errands because home is not a favorable place. Badou is the symbol of the thousands of young Africans who risk their lives trying to make it to Europe. A country that does not care for its children is sabotaging its future because, like Ngiran writes, the young people have the strength to hope and the strength to fight. Ngiran's book has sense only because there is Badou to whom they are addressed. The link between the older generation and the youth is established in the storytelling. The young need the stories of the old to carry the mantle and build the country. But if the nation pushes the young out, the stories and the nation are doomed. The next proverb that Boris uses is Dof matna bayi cim rew. Here too, Boris flips the proverb mak matna bayi cim rew, to say that a madman also is worth living in the country, and offers us the interesting and complex Ali Kaboy, the madman of Nyarela. Ali Kaboy continues the letters to Badou after Ngiran passes away. The continuity between wise man and madman is fascinating. Is Diop suggesting that a wise man is a madman and vice versa? Despite his madness, Kaboy's narrative is full of lessons and reminders. Ali Kaboy's narrative is distinct from Ngiran's poised tone, but he is able to tell us the harsh truth. His madness is wisdom because he lives at the margin of the society. He's able to observe it and in his turn, hold the mirror to it, just like Ngiran. Ngiran Faye and Ali Kaboy engage in storytelling in order to reference the past, an example in praise poetry that functions to remind Badou Tall, the readers and the monkey who they were in the past, by recounting historical events such as Talata in there, when women from there immolated themselves because they didn't want to be slaves. they bring the past to the present to prepare for the future. This future, we can hope, is in Tereb Ndeye, the notebook that only Badutal is supposed to open. Like Simeon Abenezer, whom we are told, without having written a single line in his life, was in his own way a real novelist. That is to say, when all is said and done, Boubacar Boris Diop is a storyteller of the eternal. Janam Wachina, his serpent has come down, which means that he has done his job, which is to present us with a mirror to look just like Ngiran Faye and Ali Kaboy has done for us, and find the real solutions to our fragmentations. Because ndox fa mu daan jaar ba tey boo fa demee fekk fa day tepp wherever there was water before, you will always find traces of it when you go back there. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Gueye. I really enjoyed these presentations and hope you will, I'll post questions in the chat, and we already have a question here from a person who wants to ask for any comment on the reasons, motivations behind the choice of tragic events that underpin Boris's work on memory, rather than traditional lighter storytelling, for example, etc. We do have Mr. Diop here. He could perhaps comment on that choice, but I think we could hear from Dr. Seck and Dr. Gueye first to give us a sense of their perspective on that question.
I can jump in. So thank you so much for this question. I think it has to do with the way these events were understood by the general public, or the way they were silenced, right? They have one thing in common here, is that, well, Charlie was silenced, the Rwandan genocide was misunderstood, and the facts that were circulating in the media were actually inaccurate. And he has mentioned time and time again that many were victims of not understanding the conflict and commenting on it, and therefore circulating a wrong image of what was really happening. And of course, the Jola was not, well, it is still ongoing. There are so many things that are not resolved regarding these issues, that we need to keep talking about them, so that we realize that, first of all, it's not something we should ignore. And second, there are still people who need answers. There was just the anniversary of the shipwreck was celebrated, I think, last month. And it was actually very important for people who had relatives who perished in the shipwreck to have their voices heard and to still wonder about where the bodies are. So there is this ability that we have to forget while people are still going through the suffering, that he wants to keep revisiting them, so that we are faced, like Marame said, with the consequences of our actions and of our erasures and of our misunderstandings. So that would be my short answer to the question, but I'm sure that Marame and Boris himself have more to say.
I joined Fatoumata to talk about how actually these three, I mean, he has talked a lot about many others, but these three are more toward our contemporary world. And I think it's something that we could go back to in very recent memory, especially when we're talking about Chare and talking about Ousmane Sembène's, for example, work on Chare. And this is a movie that many Africans, especially Senegalese, have not seen. So younger generation really do not know much about these events. And if we talk about Rwanda, many of us know how the world literally watched as the Rwandan genocide unfolded, and we did not really do much to prevent it, so to say. And for the Jola also, it is because of the precarities, especially the failures of the African state, the fact that the ship was overloaded. There was like the rescuers didn't get there until like hours and hours later, but then still there is no accountability whatsoever with regard to who was at fault. And even to memorialize the people, it is a challenge, so to say. So I think that rightfully so, as a novelist and as a writer, and as a militant writer, I would say, I would call Boris a militant writer. It is the the duty of memory to bring up all of these events to make sure that not only we don't forget, but we also learn from these past mistakes.
Yeah, and something that comes to mind in the case of Marame is the, as you were just saying, the West's complicity in allowing the genocide to happen. The French military had trained the Hutu military, to with these weapons to that were to become even more efficient in massacring the Tutsi. The U.S. basically turned a blind eye under President Clinton. France and the UN withdrew 90% of its peacekeeping troops. So there's this duty. The stakes of memory are, I would say, as much for the readers, for Diop's readers, in translation and in the West, and in that sense, that his militancy, I would say, is that we are all committed to understanding, to remembering, and also not forgetting that the full context of something that happened in 1994 in Rwanda, when most of the world was looking the other way. So, Boris, would you like to say something about your decision to switch from writing in French to Wolof after 1998, or after Marame?
Yeah, thank you, Daniel. So thank you, everyone, because people are interested in my work and are moved by that. Yeah, that's normal. I heard Fatoumata and Mariam, talk about Marame, about my childhood, etc. And that's very important, what Mariam said, this connection between, and that's your question, between, in fact, Marame and Domigolo, between the Rwandan genocide and my decision to write in my mother tongue, in Wolof. Yeah, I used to say that if I hadn't been to Rwanda, maybe I would have never written a novel in Wolof. Yeah, it's very strange, but you just talk about the complicity of the West. That's true. But France was, I think, no, indifferent of the West. They just turned a blind eye. But France was just, in the case of France, yeah, we have to use the word complicity. They actively help the genocidaire. They give them money, diplomatic and political support at the United Nations, weapons, everything. And so when I saw that, I just read, I tried to understand. And I read many books, including books from Jean-Pierre Chrétien, from Saint-Exupéry, Patrick de Saint-Exupéry, but maybe mainly from Colette Braakman, a Belgian journalist, and a great French historian of the Rwandan genocide, Gérard Prunier. Also Gurevitch, Philippe Gurevitch from the New Yorker. Yeah, they tried to explain why France was so deeply involved in this genocide. Yeah, which happened in Rwanda, a very small country. Yeah, at first view, you can say Rwanda doesn't mean nothing for France. But France had good political reasons to intervene in Rwanda, which was whose regime was a stooge of Paris. So they had to to help Biarimana, the Hutu power, and all these people. And one of the reasons they did it was to protect French language. Yeah. Because at that time, it's no longer the case, at that time, Rwanda was a Francophone country. So, you know, I'm a writer. I use French language, and because of French language, more than 1 million people were killed. And I use also to say that Rwanda, taught it a lesson. And for me, the most important lesson I learned from Rwanda is that, okay, we have economic problems, we have political problems in Africa, but we have, most of all, our main problem, it is a cultural problem. Because what the genocide tells us, not only about Rwandans, but about Africans, this kind of self-hate, where does it come from? And, you know, when you say culture, you have issue of language, which is very, very important. And so I decided to write in my mother tongue. It was a real challenge. It was very, very difficult. But I think now I've written three novels in Wolof. I also translated Aimé Césaire's A Season in the Congo into Wolof. And we are doing a lot of work around Wolof. Yeah, including giving classes, having Fatoumata novels, all this. She used to come at home when she's in Dakar. Also, we have the first and maybe the only newspaper online in Wolof language, to be clear, in Wolof language. It's called defuwahu.com. So the connection between Rwanda and my decision to write in Wolof, it was just said by Fatoumata and Maria. That's obvious. That's very true.
I have another question in the chat for Mr. Diop. From my student, Yulia. She writes, in the context of Holocaust literature, authors of non-Jewish origin have been accused of appropriating themselves a history that is not theirs. Have you ever experienced this kind of reaction to your work, being the Senegalese writing about the Rwandan genocide?
That's very, very interesting. You know, when we went to Rwanda, that's an important question. When we went to Rwanda in 1998, you know, the country had just collapsed. And Rwandans, they didn't understand why we were there. We told us we came to write books, but for them, it was something very, very strange. They were not interested at all by people from elsewhere to write books about the genocide, because during the genocide, they called for help, but nobody came. So what were we doing there? And interestingly, this question was mostly, in fact, raised by young Rwandans in the schools. Many times they told us, why did you come? Why do you come only now? We don't know what to answer. It's very, very, very embarrassing, to say the least. And afterwards, people they said, they tried to laugh about our project, Rwandan writing by duty of memory. I remember an article by this guy, Mancha Jawara, saying, oh yeah, I think he called that l'Odyssée rwandaise. It's like for him, yeah, what we did in Rwanda wasn't very, very serious. But now I think he won't repeat that because it was so ridiculous to talk about this project in this term. And then, yes, that's why I like this question. We heard many people saying, "Oh, you are not Rwandan. Why aren't you leaving Rwandan people to tell their own story?" But you know, this story, that's not the property of Rwandan. It's for all human beings. And at the time we were writing our books in '98, yeah, believe me, Rwandans, they have something else in mind. And by the way, in our group, Rwanda writing by duty of memory, we had two Rwandans, Venus Kahimaye and Jean-Marie Vianney Rurango. And as I say always, we were 10 writers. They were the only ones who didn't write fiction. They just couldn't. And Jean-Marie wrote a book whose title is very telling, in fact. Le génocide des Tutsis expliqué à un étranger. We can translate that. Let me explain the Tutsi genocide at a foreigner, implying that, okay, people, they still don't understand. I need to tell them. So when so many came to imagination to tell stories, maybe Rwandan writers, they weren't already at the time. But now, what do you have? You have Adelaide Mukatamba, you have Yolande Mukagasana, you have Kaitesi, you have Scholastic Mukosang, and Mukasonga, excuse me, and many other Rwandan writers, Gaël Faye, yeah, Petit Pays, Little Country. You have many Rwandan authors, yeah, telling their own story. And what can we do now? You have just to listen. And there is a great complicity between these writers and myself, and Kulsi Lamko, and maybe some other authors of our group. So there's no conflict. But the most important thing, you can't just say it happened in Rwanda, only Rwandans have to talk about it. In fact, I would have understood if someone told me, okay, there was a genocide in 1994 in Rwanda, and you have never written about it. This is, I think, the right observation. We had to write about Rwanda because it happened not in Senegal or in Mali or in Burkina Faso, elsewhere. And you know, if you take the bibliography about Rwanda, you have so many foreigners. And I would say from the West. There's more authors writing from about the genocide who are from the West than authors who are from Africa. In fact, in a way, we were in a kind of exception. And sometimes I think that that's very sad. Yeah, we don't talk enough about Rwanda. We should do it every day. And you remember, when someone was asked, is it possible to write poetry after the Holocaust? He said, yes. We will write poetry about after the Holocaust, but it will always be about the Holocaust. We can say the same thing about the Rwandan genocide. Fiction, and it must be about the Rwandan genocide every time.
I was really struck in your interview last year with Jean-Pierre Gueye. You were talking about the Anti-Defamation League pyramid of hate and how genocide just doesn't happen in a vacuum, that these acts of prejudice and acts of discrimination and violent acts build up. And that's not just a lesson for Rwanda, it's a lesson for all of us today in many ways throughout the world. So I think that's a really, I think that was, especially in the context of denial of the genocide denial period. I think that's a really important point. So I just put that in the chat. I do have a quick question for Dr. Seck. Your book, Materializing Imaginaries, is there a chapter about Diop in there? And could you tell us more about where it's at in the process?
Yes, there is a chapter about Diop, and it's about memory. I'm interested in how, his intellectual life, the literary foraging from the 60s and 70s. Diop was very active in Senegal, and he has influenced many people who were to become politicians, writers, etc., by holding these book clubs in his home. And reading all these quote unquote revolutionary texts, and even enacting the play that I mentioned, African Dawn by Fodeba Keita. I'm sure he can recite a few lines from it. He knows it by heart. So just to tell you how intense that moment was and the impact it had on his first novels, Le Temps de Tamango, Le Temps pour la Mémoire, and you have all these unsung heroes that he tries to resuscitate through fiction in very interesting ways. And I think that's why I put so much emphasis on his aesthetic experimentation, because he really tries to use fiction in a way that forces us to see how literary texts get us to certain to a way of reckoning with memory. And I particularly like a line in Le Cavalier et son ombre night in his shadow, in which he talks about how Khadija reshaped the first hours of the meeting she had with Latsukabe, her lover. And I'm quoting here, with the power of recollection that both distorted things, but yet was so accurate. So he plays with fiction in a way that it's fiction, but it is so telling of what is happening outside of the fictional world that you can't help but being caught up with it. So that's basically what I'm trying to grapple with in that chapter, how he deals with memory, and how literature in particular helps us get to the stakes of memory, I would say, and of course the duty of memory. So the book is more or less a cultural history of the Senegalese left, talking about a cultural movement that was born in the 70s and how people in their 20s thought to imagine the nation otherwise. They were mainly against Leopold Sedar Senghor's idea of the Homo Senegalensis, and they thought to create their own version. And I want to know what their version was and what would have happened had we imagined the country through their eyes. Again, this idea of speculating about the future when we reached independence, which is also central to Diop's work. What would have happened had the country been imagined differently? So futures past. So I'll keep it there, but happy to talk more about it.
I think a whole dissertation about Diop's narrators and storytellers and artist figures in his work that could be written. It would be a really interesting study, I think. So Dr. Gueye, is your talk today part of a larger project on Diop, or what else do you have happening in your
Unfortunately, I'm not one of those scholars who writes about Diop, but I enjoy his work because of my interest in wall of literature and storytelling. So I haven't written about Diop, and this is probably the first time I'm putting pen to paper about his work, but I'm an avid reader of Diop.
I love your interpretation of the Proverbs and how they are woven into a book like Domigolo. And so we'll be reading that next in our class. I'm really excited to see how that plays out again as we read it together. We're getting close to the end of our time together today. I just wanted to remind you that we have time for maybe one more question if anyone wants to pose it in the chat. There's also an opportunity throughout this week to get some signed copies of books by Diop. We'll have those that will do drawings. For those of you who are registered for the Lit Fest, we'll draw names out of the list of registered attendees and email you if you've won, and we'll try to announce some of those winners over the next couple of days. We'll have a giveaway of books tomorrow morning by the NSK Prize jury, who will be doing a reading in anticipation of the announcement that Kathy Neustadt will make tomorrow afternoon at 1:45 Central Time to announce the winner of the 2023 NSK Neustadt Prize for Children's and Young Adult Literature. And then we'll come back to Diop's work with a conversation event with Dr. Buyana Coulibaly and Boris Diop to talk about his work in the context of Writing Africa Today is the title for that talk. And then he will also give a keynote speech called How Do We Say Genocide in Wolof at 3 o'clock tomorrow afternoon. So stay tuned for those events tomorrow. We'll also be giving away some signed copies of the Neustadt anthology, Dispatches from the Republic of Letters, which came out a couple of years ago. So there's lots of good things happening all around on the festival this week over the next couple of days. So well, let me thank again Dr. Fatoumata Seck, Dr. Marame Gueye for their wonderful presentations today and for really bringing some enlightenment to our understanding of the work of our 2022 laureate, Boubacar Boris Diop. And I don't see any other questions in the chat. So
actually, Daniel, there is one.
Oh, I didn't see it.
From Anna.
Oh, sorry. No, thank
Yeah.
you. Thank you, Anna. Is there any other possibility for Africans to share and preserve their memory/history without employing any colonial language and benefit all of Africa? I'm a novelist writing in Swahili, but the people in West Africa, for example, would not understand what I write. Thank you. Translation or other opportunities for writers to preserve.
I do think that Boubacar Boris Diop has given us the tools so that with what he's done with Domogolo, writing and then translating, like he has said, our languages deserve a chance. So I think that even though West Africans and East Africans might not understand each other if they write, for example, in Swahili, I think writing in Swahili itself is a start, and then we can translate from Swahili to European languages for wider audiences like he has done with Domigolo.
I just will add, Murambi was just translated into Ekegusi, which is a Kenyan language, and in Swahili too, by a Kenyan translator, Jeno Buchi. Yeah, she just did it last month, and we are in the process of publishing it. Yeah, and we would like also to translate Murambi in Kinyarwanda. Everybody can understand why it is so important to translate, especially important to translate Murambi in Kinyarwanda. But for Ekegusi, which is a language in Kenya, and Swahili, yeah, it has already been done. And it's an important step. And Jane, who did it, already translated Romeo and Juliet in Swahili, Ngugi wa Thiong'o's books in the Swahili, etc., etc. So you have translation from Kikuyu to Swahili, from Kikuyu to Ekegusi, because Jane is from Ekegusi origin. Yeah, that's what I wanted to add.
Thank you so much, Boris. Thank you again to our panelists. With that, we'll see you back tomorrow morning with the NSK reading at 11:30 Central Time on Zoom. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon, and we'll see you again soon. Thanks, everyone.